So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today I want to take a look at a channel that I was introduced to by Kent Hovind's secretary. In an email insisting that I should give my full name, a picture, my phone number, blood type, mother's maiden name, social security number, the name of the street I grew up on, and a stool sample. Okay, some of those are made up. There was also a signature line that included links to various creationist sources. One was a link to a podcast about feathered dinosaurs by a person who goes by In His Image. It turns out the podcast was about Oculodentavis, and in the podcast he recommended I visit his YouTube page. Of course I did so, and was surprised to find that he was live streaming. We had a very pleasant chat, and he seems quite nice and polite. I later went back to take a look at his channel and found his main video on feathered dinosaurs, and I figured I should respond to some of the things in there. I'm linking to the original video, but In His Image has been nothing but polite and kind, so if you visit his channel, please show him the same courtesy. He doesn't have a lot of views, and I don't want him chased off of YouTube. If you go and decide to chat or comment, please be respectful. Not that I expect you to be otherwise. I have a pretty cool audience after all. Well, enough preamble. Let's see what we've got in this video.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining In His Image today. Today we're going to be discussing, did dinosaurs have feathers? This has been kind of a big thing in the media and in the creationist evolutionist groups that go around. So because of a paper that came out from the International Conference on Creationism, I almost said it wrong, International Conference on Creationism, which is otherwise known as the ICC, which I'll refer to it as such throughout this presentation. The ICC paper basically said that that there were feathered dinosaurs.
I'm not sure if I should be impressed that the creationist conference actually admitted to this, or if I should be disappointed that they could have their heads in the sand for so long. It's always interesting to see how much overwhelming evidence has to pile up before creationists will admit to something that doesn't fit well into their positions. Especially when it's something that they were so long dismissive of. They've already accepted basically all of evolution in order to fit the so-called kinds onto the ark. Now they accept feathered dinosaurs that aren't birds. Well, the ICC does. I happen to know In His Image doesn't.
And they basically just did an uncritical evaluation of the evolutionary data sets that they used and did a bunch of cladistics on it and came up with feathered dinosaurs.
I don't think it was just uncritical acceptance of mainstream paleontology data, because not even mainstream paleontologists look at it uncritically, and they're not so blinkered as to reject evolutionary theory.
However, there are some significant problems with that paper and with the feathered dinosaur idea in general, but more on that in a moment.
At this point, he introduces himself, but I left the link to the video in the description, and for the sake of time, I'm going to cut it out. Check out his video if you want those details.
Let's move on into talking about reptiles, birds, and whether there is crossover between the two. So let's look first at reptile traits, and this is Acrocanthosaurus, which is a large reptile, a very tyrannosaurid-like reptile.
In fact, Acrocanthosaurus is pretty far away from a T-Rex. They're basically on opposite sides of one branch of the theropod family tree, that is, the Tetanurans. Acrocanthosaurus being an Allosauroid and T-Rex being a Coelurosaur. This is one of the oldest splits in Theropoda, but that's okay. Let's take a look at it. It is a cool taxon.
Acrocanthosaurus is a very interesting creature. Now, I don't want to belabor Acrocanthosaurus too much. I just want to point out some features here. Notice where this double arrow is. The double arrow pointing at the tail is for hemal and neural spines. Those are the things sticking up and down. The hemal and neural spines are points of attachment for muscle. Now, muscular tissue is what provides a lot of weight to the tail. This enables that tail to act as a counterweight. Otherwise, the Acrocanthosaurus would not be able to stand upright. It would have to go along on all fours.
Kinda? The neural spines are used for the attachment of muscles and tendons, but the hemal arches, as their name implies, are there to protect the blood supply to the tissues of the tail. It is true that most bipedal dinosaurs relied on their tail to counterbalance their heads and torsos. This wasn't the case for all of them, or for dinosaurs that were obligate quadrupeds, like Triceratops. I should also point out that having caudal neural spines and hemal arches isn't a defining characteristic of reptilia. Many lizards lack such features in their caudal vertebrae altogether, but somehow I don't think that makes these lizards not reptiles.
And notice too that you have the hip bones, the pubic bone, the ischial bone, and the iliac bone. The iliac blade being the massive thing that you see right at the hip. All right? So some other reptile traits here really quickly. They're cold-blooded. This means that they have to regulate their body temperature via an external means.
Well, the modern reptiles most people know by that name are cold-blooded. But that is not the case for all fossil reptiles. In fact, being warm-blooded seems to be the default trait for archosaurs, the group that includes crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Crocodilians today are cold-blooded, but they retain a vestigial fourth chamber in their hearts, hinting at their more active warm-blooded ancestry. In fact, just to grow as quickly as we know many dinosaurs did, they would have had to have had a metabolism fast enough to easily make them warm-blooded. Also, measures of oxygen isotopes in theropod bones seem to indicate that theropods, like Giganotosaurus, a relative of Acrocanthosaurus, had constant internal body temperatures, at least while growing.
They are covered in hard scutes, not scales, scutes.
Well, I think you'll find that squamate reptiles would beg to differ as to whether they have scales or not, but birds have scales, and scutes, and feathers, as did many dinosaurs. So I'm not sure about the importance of this. Further, lacking such features doesn't stop an animal from being a reptile. For example, there are some bearded dragons that never grow scales, instead having soft, smooth, non-glandular skin. They are called silkies, and while they do require extra care from keepers, they are not otherwise significantly hindered by this condition, and they are certainly still reptiles.
Most reptiles. Some reptiles, the lizards and the snakes, are covered in scales. There's a difference. I'm not going to dig into the weeds of all that, but a scute is what you typically see in an alligator, and it's also what we typically find with dinosaurs.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that he had corrected that from the first time I watched this, which was admittedly late at night while playing a video game after a livestream. But scutes are actually not commonly found on dinosaurs. I have them, and we know of some other allosauroids that had them, such as abelisaurs, but the most common non-filamentous skin covering in dinosaurs are reticulate scales, which are small round scales, the same kind you'd find on the bottom of an eagle's foot.
The pelvis is associated with the spinal bone. Now that's a bunch of big words, which basically means that the hip bones are attached directly into the spinal column. They're not fused, but they attach to the spinal column. Right? And then they have amniotic eggs. These are leathery eggs. These are eggs that you might find, they have some give to them. Not a lot, but they do have some give to them. They're leathery. You don't want to boil these things.
No, that's not what being amniotic means. Amniotic eggs are eggs that develop an amnion. The amnion is a membrane common to mammals, reptiles, and birds, or reptiles including birds, to be more precise. And it is the innermost membrane in the eggs of those animals. Mammals are just as much amniotes as reptiles, and birds lay amniotic eggs. What is unusual about bird eggs is that their eggs are hard-shelled, so in his image may be conflating hard and soft-shelled eggs. But interestingly, we know dinosaurs had hard-shelled eggs anyway.
At least, not a general idea. They have lungs, shocking I know, but that does differentiate them from amphibians, but their lungs are kind of similar to what we see in mammals. They have tidal respiration, in, out, etc.
While some salamanders have lost their lungs, most amphibians have lungs. Just look at a living frog chilling out on a log. One of the things that's most noticeable is that it's breathing, and it's breathing with lungs. In fact, lungfish also have lungs, hence the name. Lungs go back to at least Sarcopterygi, that is the lobe-finned fish, which includes all amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles.
Birds don't, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, a few more reptile traits. They have variable body plans. They have a diaphragm.
I'm not sure what is meant by variable body plan, as it's a very vague phrase, but one thing I would like to say is that reptiles are absolutely not characterized by a diaphragm. In fact, nearly all reptiles entirely lack a diaphragm, although crocodilians do have one, and a few lizards have what could be considered partial diaphragms. Saying that this is a characteristic of reptiles would be like saying that having an opposable big toe is a characteristic of mammals. Sure, some mammals have it, I guess, but it's far more characteristic of birds than mammals. Similarly, a diaphragm is far more characteristic of mammals than reptiles.
Diaphragm's a big deal because diaphragm is what pushes the material in and out of the lungs.
except that nearly all reptiles actually use muscles connected from their spine to their ribs to laterally expand and contract their rib cages and thereby force air into and out of the lungs. Although in animals that do have true diaphragms, that is one of the main uses of it.
And when I say material, I definitely mean air. All right, so we're talking about air coming in and out of the lungs through a means of what's called tidal respiration.
Honestly, I hadn't heard the term tidal respiration before, so I looked into it. It's a medical term that refers to the relatively steady state of breathing when someone is at rest. It's more of a variety of respiratory modes of a single organism than a description of the basic mode of respiration of a taxon.
So just bear that in mind. Diaphragms are very important because of that.
Yeah, they're important to creatures that have them, which most reptiles don't.
Alright, moving on just a little bit. Standard sternum. Now this is important because birds have a specialized sternum with a keel attached, which we will get to momentarily, but just, bear it in mind that the reptiles have what we call a standard sternum that you would see across most vertebrates.
Okay, I will keep it very much in mind that according to you, if it doesn't have a keeled sternum, it can't be a bird.
Non-pneumatic bones. This is a big deal. Although not all bones are non-pneumatic. Some of them are, and particularly in the larger reptiles, you will see more pneumatic bone, because pneumatic bone is hollow bone.
If reptiles have pneumatic bones, then it can't be that big a deal in trying to separate birds from reptiles. That just means birds have a trait found in reptiles, but just have a lot of it.
And what hollow bone does is hollow bone permits strength, because they've got little bony struts running through them, strength while reducing weight. And if you're walking around on two legs and you're as tall as, Tyrannosaurus, you're going to want to reduce that weight as much as you can.
That's true, but many smaller dinosaurs also have pneumatic bones, as did pterosaurs and pseudosuchians. That is, fossil taxa that are closer to crocodilians than to dinosaurs.
And they lack what are called nasal conchae. Now, we'll get into what nasal conchae are in just a minute, but they don't have them. And lacking them tends to mean that things are cold-blooded. By the way, dinosaurs, so far as I know...
Well, a few things. First, nasal conchae are known in reptiles, although in most of them they are primarily olfactory rather than temperature regulation structures. That being said, they do not preserve well, being often paper-thin. However, Eoplocephalus, an ankylosaur, almost certainly had them, and not all birds have them.
None of them have been found with nasal conchae. So this is a reptilian skeleton. This is a crocodilian. Now, there are some differences between crocodilians and dinosaurs, but you can see there on the bottom, right there with where the tail is, you've got the neural and hemal arches. You've got a very reptilian hip there. You notice how the spine bones that I've pointed to do not actually fuse into the hip. They're just there.
Right, but that's not how dinosaur hips are. And since this is about feathered dinosaurs and the bird-dinosaur connection, it's a bit odd to use a crocodilian to demonstrate the supposed differences in hip structure. But we'll get more into that later.
Now, I will point out that the knee also is outside the body, unlike in birds where it needs to be inside.
No.
Bird knees, as a rule, are not inside the body wall. But because the femur is usually held more or less parallel to the spine and doesn't move much during walking, and because of the fact that it is generally under the feathers, it does not appear to be outside the body. Penguins are an exception to this, but as a rule, and as you might know if you've ever roasted a bird, or seen a roasted bird, the knees are generally not within the body wall. Although they do have some more skin connecting them to the torso than is typical in mammals or, say, lizards.
I will point out, however, that the caiman or the gavial, which I can't remember which this is.
It's a gavial, also known as a gharial. In fact, it's the top image search for gharial skeleton on Google. At first, I considered that it could be a false gharial, but the round dorsal and anterior margins of the orbit and the abrupt narrowing of the mouth, along with the relatively smooth bone texture on the nasal bone, make it fairly clear that it's a true gharial. Not that I'm some kind of expert. If you need crocodilian identification advice, consult your local herpetologist.
Seen here has legs that are off to the side, whereas a typical dinosaur would have legs that are directly underneath. Alright, so that's just a brief overview, and of course now this is the look at a dinosaur with relatively similar structure. Note that the legs are underneath. By the way, this is Equixinactosaurus. That's probably the first thing I will mispronounce. It will not be the last.
Even professional paleontologists don't always say these crazy names the same way as each other. I tell everyone just do your best and don't skip letters.
Because my pronunciation is terrible to start with, and on top of that, a lot of the words are in Chinese, and I think some people in the named them Chinese names because they knew I wouldn't be able to pronounce them. Anyways, moving on swiftly. So you notice that you have the ischiac on the ilium and the pubic bones, the hemal and neural spines, etc. All right. So let's talk about some features of birds. Birds are warm-blooded. It means they regulate their body temperature internally rather than externally. They're covered in feathers. Now, that's an important point because, as we'll discover as we go through the list of various dinosaurs and birds, feathers are pretty unique.
They are. In fact, they're so unique that when they were found on animals that definitely were not birds, it was more or less proof positive that birds were a member of a larger group. That is, Dinosauria. Because feathers are not unique to birds, but to dinosaurs. Or, depending on how the evidence shakes out, maybe Ornithodira, the group that includes pterosaurs and dinosaurs together.
Now, they're not a necessarily completely defining characteristic. There are some other things that make birds birds besides just feathers, but they're pretty close. They're almost like hair in mammals.
That's fair. Having feathers isn't enough to make an animal a bird, and having hair isn't enough to make it a mammal. But then again, they are pretty darn characteristic of those two groups of animals. But I think that's going to be all for today. There will be at least a few more episodes of this, as he still has a lot to go through. If you like this video, why not leave it a like, and a comment? If you hate it, leave a dislike and tell me why you hated it. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the bell icon, so you're always notified when there's new Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching. But before you go, I'd like to take some time to thank my patrons, especially my $20 and above patrons. Ian Chen, Chris Love, Henry Hutanen, Bob Knob, The Evil Scotsman, and Bent Hovind. As you know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and my patrons give me much needed stability. If you'd like to join the team, there's a link in the description to my Patreon, which starts at $1. If you'd like, I also have a link to my Teespring store and an Amazon wishlist.
So you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that this is? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.